Hi, uh, my name is Sisi, and this is my talk, Games Without Borders, an inquiry about imagination. This is a talk mostly aimed towards practitioners of narrative design, but hopefully it will be interesting to people who just have a passing interest in story and video game storytelling. So my name is Cece, and I'm a writer and narrative designer. I was recently nominated for the IGF Excellence in Narrative Award. Um, I recently shipped Signs of the Sojourner. I've shipped Lion Killer, and I'm currently working on some small projects that I am not really good at telling people about, called Theseus and Six Semper Tyrannis. So that's kind of what I'm up to, and I've made some games, and so let's proceed. So most I find that most narrative games are very focused on being puzzle boxes, in that the player is supposed to solve the narrative puzzle. For example, a lot of games are about collecting narrative games, exploration games are about collecting the key to escape the jail or to proceed to the next bit of gated content. It's about saying the right things to succeed in a social situation, or it's about solving the mystery by combining clues in a certain way to solve the whodunits. And so, as anyone who's written tutorial text can sympathize, narrative is traditionally used as a vehicle to go towards guiding the player towards the solution. And that's actually the bulk. I think that's the bulk of narrative, really, is to tell the player where to go, what to do, how to proceed to the next bit of content. But what if narrative could exist beyond the puzzle box? Because what if we had storytelling that for reasons that weren't about solving the puzzle? And so this is really a talk about valuing narrative beyond the solution value, but to a valuing narrative for the purposes of furthering a player's imagination. So in Lion Killer, there's actually an abacus puzzle at the pretty early on, and it basically it asks it kind of, you can't see it right now, but there's actually an expansion option to see the rules of what the heck is an abacus. And I kind of got this idea because I was in China several years ago, and I saw a really old traditional abacus at a corner store. So I was inspired by the fact that there was actually a abacus at a shop that I was at. And so what the players asked to do is to calculate the totals of the abacus and enter it into the ledger. And so you can enter there's a bunch of different numbers, and you can enter whichever one you want. And the reason I made this puzzle is really because I felt a lot of found an insecurity, I think, that is very familiar to a lot of narrative designers, is that we felt like we need to gamify our narrative game. Otherwise, it's not a video game, or it's going to be looked at as lesser. And I really want to push back against it, but also I'm thinking that where we can come to a different kind of approach with puzzle games. Because why is it important to solve the puzzle? I don't personally care if you solve the puzzle or not. I did a good hard look at myself, and I was like, do I care if you're good at solving an abacus? Not really. The game doesn't really punish you for failing the puzzle. That's kind of, I guess, a secret, because I think the punishment should be intentional. You should have a design reason for punishing the player, when they fail. And it shouldn't, I don't think failure should be kind of the default way of respond for the game to respond to players not doing what it's supposed to do. And so in this game, failing is not always failure. There's narrative space for intentionally sabotaging the ledger, or other character motivations for why you because yeah, there's a lie option. There's an option where you consciously lied about the amount of money that the store has earned. But there's also the other failure, I guess the failure options of the failure options of if you got the wrong number, if you calculated the total and you got the wrong number, it still leads you to the screen at the bottom, which is maybe you're a sloppy mathematician, or you could have tried to consciously cheat the owner out of money. And I think it's just really interesting to kind of use a failure as a storytelling space to be actually people are motivated by different things, and maybe it could be that it doesn't necessarily have to be a black and white failure. for a puzzle box. So this is a Don't Wake the Night is a game that I played several months ago by Santo, who is an indigenous game designer. And I was really fascinated by the premise because it kind of felt like a courtroom game almost, in that you're an omnipresent spirit. Well, not omnipresent, but like you're basically a spirit that's been summoned by this community in order to like evaluate like the outcome of someone breaking the rules within the community. And so like you're kind of an anxious spirit and you listen to people talk. And the really weird thing that I felt when I was playing the game is that like it takes spectating to the utmost extreme, in that you're spectating, but you can obviously tell that they're having entire conversations about issues that you don't really understand. There's like they're gossiping about like specific situations that you have zero context for. You're obviously like not part of the conversation because they're gossiping among themselves. And so you have to make a decision at the end about what to do with the rule breaker. And you don't know the context. You're just making a choice without really solving anything. You're not really understanding if what the person did was like that bad, because you're ultimately a spectator. And I think that was like really realistic. And I thought it was a really interesting approach to game design, because we don't always know the answer. And I think that's the kind of the main takeaway of this talk, is that like solving a puzzle, it's not always like you don't have to do like collect clues and then solve the puzzle. You can also be like you're clueless the entire time, and that's like realistic for most scenarios. It's like if you jump into like if you're jumping into some people's conversation in real life, unlike video game characters, you're like, I have no idea what the situation is, and I really actually have no business like getting involved because I don't know the context. And I think it's just like these kinds of games are interesting in reinforcing that like you're not the best person to like kind of solve the situation. So this is part of like Borders Part 2, is that like borders have never been truly real to me. Like I like, besides the countries that I've visited, I've lived in like 3 different countries. So like to me, like borders are kind of like, they're real, but they're not really like solid things. And so like people, goods, and trauma flow across arbitrary lines on the map. And this is especially true because like everything about like my heritage, it's just like the stuff just kind of like comes in and comes in and out of the country, out of the US. And it's not like it's like, to me, like the borders are like less real, I guess, to like a lot of people. And so this is kind of why I've always had a fascination for like secret identities and like off-screen subplots, because I think like when you're like an immigrant in a diaspora and you have like other identities like being queer, it's like you have like you're juggling like 3 to 4 or 5 different identities at once. And that's kind of why I'm always like mentally, when I'm designing things, I always assume that there's like several layers of motivations, and there's different kind of things going on. So this is kind of a call out to like most video games, but the world is larger than your game. Like there are a lot of European RPGs where like Asia just does not exist, or it's tiny, or like if it's fictionalized, if it's a totally fictionalized version of the world, Asia is tiny, it doesn't exist. And like that's just really weird to me, because Asia exists whether or not Europe acknowledges that it exists. And especially in world building, it is very strange to me because like Africa is like Northern Africa like influenced the entire cultural development of Spain for like literally forever, and Africa is literally across the sea. And somehow games are very like liberal about borrowing from like Greece, even though Greece is all the way on that side of the Mediterranean, but it doesn't borrow as much from Africa, which is just like very, very strange. I just like, what is going on? Because like it just like historically it just doesn't make any sense to me. And it's just really awkward because borders are political constructions. They're not real. Like it is like the Mediterranean has been kind of like a body of water that like has been transporting people and goods forever. And so like borders like even though like I think game designers tend to set like hard boundaries around like the scope of their game, if you've ever seen tea in a game about Victorian England, then you're observing the colonization of India. If your characters are produced wearing mass-produced cotton shirts at a certain point of British history, then chattel slavery is also in your game, whether or not you explicitly say Britain is still trading for cotton with slave owners. It's like, even if you don't say it, it's like there. So so I really think that video games now have like a lot more like hard borders about like kind of like the world building than like real life. And so, of course, I'm going to address the game designer concern is that you do not have the budget to build the entire world. And I'm totally sympathetic to that. Like, I personally am very like, manage scope, don't go too wild. And I personally do also believe that less is more. Like, you don't have to like build the entire, like, you don't have to build like 10 continents. I know there's only 7, but you know. But you should know the story. I think it's really important for the designer to know like the what's going on in the world, but don't resolve all the story beats. For example, this is an example, but if you're building a game about like the Pacific theater of World War II, like the US versus Japan, even if the game just focuses mostly on like a US versus Japan, the European theater is still occurring elsewhere in the world. And we're conscious of that because Europe, the European theater of World War II is such a big imprint, big part of our cultural memory. And I think we should approach game design with the assumption that other people from around the world have a very different cultural memory of like things happened, even if Europe doesn't like consciously think about it. And it doesn't mean that you have to build both theaters of the war. You can just make a game about like the US versus Japan in World War II. But you know, like it's still like, I think it's better world building to at least sometimes like give a nod in somewhere in the narrative that like, oh, the European theater is occurring at roughly the same time. So in my example of the of Lion Killer is that there's a Jesuit character who is kind of shady in Lion Killer, and the Jesuit character does not have a name. He doesn't have a fully fleshed background. You have no idea if he's still together with his family. Actually, obviously not, because he's in China. But like, you know, like you don't really know what's up with him, and I never really like explain what's up with him. Like there's like drug smuggling plotline, and like only in one route is it made like super explicit that like this guy is the one who's involved. But it's like the point of like a lot of what I did with the Jesuit character is like drawing out player curiosity about what's happening in the city setting and foreshadowing like post-war, you know, like post-opium war conflict with the Christians. So that's like I didn't have to build the entire character. I just had to tease enough that there's something going on. There's like a big like there's kind of a bigger things afoot. So even I actually took this as the most logical extreme, where I had a kind of a war scene in one of the battles that I can't remember off the top of my head, and that you literally don't know who lived or who died. There is like a scene where like you are like defending yourself against a soldier who is paid to kill you, and you're like, war is really like violent, and you don't really like, and like you're the only person in all of the smog to know the reality of what happened. And I don't necessarily outline like exactly what happened, because I'm a big believer that like you like that like people like know the truth, but like you don't necessarily have to like spell it out. And so like I kind of like the sepoys being involved is just implying that China was just one part of Britain's like bigger like colonial war. I mean, not war, but like I guess they were in conflict with Russia. So like it was kind of like a bigger geopolitical thing going on in Asia, because I think what a lot of games about this period failed to convey is that few modern wars are two-nation conflicts. There's like a whole bunch of colonies like also like kind of being a part of it, and like and so like I think that's just really important to build out. Oh yeah, because like people have different cultural memory, right? Like people might remember the war totally differently. People from different countries will think about the war totally in a center a different part of like what happened. And so like I guess the conclusion is that like that when you're telling a story in a video game, you should know as close to 100% of your story as possible, but only build about 30%. Like, but you still should have this full like picture in your head, Because if you imply that everything is already in the game, like if you put like all of your world building in the game, then you limit people's ability to have imagination when they're playing your game. I think you should like definitely, this is not an excuse to be like, oh, we're just not going to put any like other kinds of like people on your screen, because I still think on screen diversity is important. But I think you should allow all the like thousands or millions of people who are not in the game to also exist in this world, instead of just enforcing a hard border along like what kinds of like people exist in your game world. Because it'll be awkward if you're saying we're going to give you 100% of the world building, but we didn't have time to build out all the people that we didn't include in the game, because like scope is always a thing. And so it's really important, I think, to narrative design beyond the camera. And what I mean by designing beyond the camera and not building beyond the camera is like, you should have like, again, like all of this off-screen storytelling, instead of just like putting everything there. And I think just as game designers, we shouldn't hold all the secrets to our world. I think we should let people like imagine what the heck is happening in your world. Just like, because like, I think reality is like, I do think that I'm not one of those people who think that reality is, you know, is like subjective. No, I think there is one reality, but I think that not everyone has the full picture. Not everyone has all of the secrets. And the hard thing for a lot of people to accept, I think, is that these secrets don't all belong to the player. They don't all belong to the designers. It's a kind of a process in which like they don't belong to one person. They belong to like your entire audience. So like, this is an argument against like narrative borders. Like, I'm not telling you like don't have borders between like two countries if your game is like if your game is like Civilization or something. But it's just like, I think that being able to decide what does and doesn't exist is kind of a colonial mentality. I could probably write an entire talk about just that, but basically that like we kind of like, when you decide that the player is the one who kind of like gets to decide, or even the game designer gets to decide that certain things exist and other things don't, then that's kind of the extension of empire. So fictional worlds need to be able to breathe. They need to be able to exist on their own terms. Before I wrap up, I actually want to point out that decolonizing video games is not purely like a design, just tweaking a few things about design. Because if you like this talk, the whole reason I was able to give it is because a white woman gave me her speaking slot at Amaze Fest. So it's like decolonization is not just about like knowing what to do. It's also about getting collaborators on board, even if you have to like sacrifice a few things. So like the fact that this talk happened at all is a result of that sacrifice. So like if you're like looking to like decolonize video games in general, like that's a good start. Yeah, so cool, thanks. Thanks for attending my talk. I am not sure if y'all had a good time or a bad time, but hopefully y'all had a good time. And I think there's Q&A, so I guess we'll go to that. Yeah, this one's from Jordan. And that's actually what I constantly think about. And I think what a lot of people, when they design games for a global audience, like they don't realize that all those global audiences have like a different cultural memory of events. And obviously this is a part of privilege, right? When you're a part of empire, you don't have to think about what other people think of your empire. But like, definitely, like I think that if you're like educated on like a certain history, then you can't look at like historical films without thinking, that was a result of a really immoral economic system. So like, yeah, like I definitely, like when I see tea on screen in like a Victorian England setting, I was like, is this before or after they destroyed my country? So like, that's actually something that people will think about when they're playing your game, or at least a lot of people will, because of the way that we remember things very differently. So I think it's just important to acknowledge that.